in 1997, there were more than 2 million payphones in the United States. But today, just 15 years later, there are fewer than half that many. What does that mean? Does it mean that people don't talk to each other as much as they used to? Does it mean that people aren't communicating with one another like they did in the past? Not at all. No, with the rise of things like Facebook, Twitter, cell phones, and texting, people are communicating with each other much more than they have ever done so in the past, but they're just doing it in a different way. Times have changed, and the way that people communicated in the past is not the same as how people communicate today. Or consider the Kodak company. Chances are, when you hear that name, Kodak, you think of rolls of film. But did you know that Kodak stopped making film 10 years ago? Because with the rise of digital cameras, hardly anyone uses film anymore. But do you know who first invented digital cameras? Kodak did, back in 1975. But even though they were the first to invent that technology, they didn't pursue making digital cameras because they figured that selling film had always been the cornerstone of their business, and they just assumed that selling film would always continue to be the cornerstone of their business. But as a result of that way of thinking, as a result of assuming that the way that things were in the past was the way that they were always going to be, Kodak eventually had to file for bankruptcy. Change is never easy for us. Many times we wish that the way that things were in the past was the way that they always would be. After all, the past is what we know and are familiar with. The past is what we're used to. That's why it was such a traumatic event when the prophet Elijah declared that the time had come for him to depart this world. For years and years, the people of Israel had gotten used to Elijah's spiritual leadership. They had gotten used to the way that he denounced the evil kings and queens of their day. They had gotten used to the powerful ways that God had spoken through him and the amazing things that God had done through him. But now, Elijah said, the time had come for him to depart this earth and for there to be a transition to a new spiritual leader for Israel, namely his chief disciple, who had the somewhat similar sounding name of Elisha. But it seems that no one, including Elisha, was really looking forward to that change. 2 different times, groups of unnamed, lesser-known prophets went up to Elisha and said, "What do you think of this change that's coming? Are you ready for it?" And how did Elisha respond? He responded by saying, "Keep quiet." He responded by saying, "Shut up. I don't want to think about it, and I don't want to talk about it." It certainly seems that at least initially, Elisha wasn't that keen about this change that was going to take away his master and leave him as the new spiritual leader for Israel. And then, after Elijah was taken by God, After Elijah did ascend to heaven amid that whirlwind and those chariots of fire, and Elisha alone returned back across the Jordan River, how did those unnamed prophets respond to Elisha? They didn't cheer for him. They didn't put him up on their shoulders and carry him around and welcome him as their new leader. No, right away, those prophets organized search parties, hoping that maybe that whirlwind had just lifted Elijah up and set him down somewhere in the vicinity. And so they searched for 3 days for Elijah, because they weren't quite sure they were ready to embrace that change that was taking place. And only after they had searched for those 3 days did they finally come to acknowledge that whether they liked it or not, they had to deal with a future that was going to be different from their past. That whether they liked it or not, Elijah was gone. And it was Elisha who was with them now. When you read the story of the Exodus in the Bible, what was the most frequent problem that Moses had as he led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt and across the desert for those 40 years as he guided them toward their goal of the Promised Land? Probably his biggest problem was that time and time again, every time he turned around, the people were complaining, "We're hungry, we're thirsty, we're afraid. Why can't we go back? Why can't we go back to Egypt and stay there?" And so time and time again, Moses had to keep reminding the people that the future that God had in mind for them was not behind them. It was not to be found back in Egypt. No, the future that God had in mind for them was out there in front of them. And in order to get to that future, Moses said, the people were going to need to let go of their nostalgia for Egypt, their obsession with the past, and move onward in the way that God was trying to lead them. It's like what the Apostle Paul said in the New Testament in his letter to the Philippians. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on to the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. In essence, Paul was saying that he devoted his life to constantly moving forward to the goal that God had for him. Constantly moving forward to fulfill the mission that God had for his life. The question is, do we have a clear picture of the goal that we are headed to? Do we have a clear picture of our mission?